So welcome back, everyone. Welcome to 19V. I'm Margaret Shamu from the New Schools Parsons School of Design. And our speaker today is Fiona Bell from Yale University. Fiona will present her work titled White Slavery and the Marriage Plot, Ivan Turgenev's Fathers and Children in the Global Emancipation Era. And her собеседник will be Maria Tarutina from Brown University. So Fiona.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And thank you to the 19V group for inviting me and to Maria for serving as discussant. So let me share my screen. Okay, thumbs up that you can see the slide. Okay, great. So since at least the 17th century, foreigners have racialized Russian people of all classes by comparing them to Black or Asian people. These comparisons rarely disarticulate Russianness from whiteness or suggest an affinity or solidarity with other groups. Rather, they attempt to define Russianness as a kind of whiteness, provisional and perhaps performative. So in the 1850s, for example, the liberal Russian writer Alexander Herzen compared Russia to a man in whiteface. He writes, "Our civilization is cutaneous, rude debauchery. Under our powder, there's stubble. Under our white paint, a tan is visible. We have the cunning of the wild, the debauchery of animals, the evasiveness of slaves." So in these middle decades of the 19th century, after Great Britain legally ended the slave trade and anti-slavery discourse continued in the United States, such claims about the racial identity of Russian people tended to invoke serfdom, the institution of bonded labor in the Russian Empire since the 17th century. For some liberal commentators, like Herzen, the Russian ruling class undermined its own whiteness by maintaining this violent regime. In a seeming paradox, the practice of enserfment turned the gentry into slaves. In other accounts, serfdom threatened the whiteness of the enserfed peasantry, whose centuries of bonded labor had made them in some ways comparable to enslaved Black people in this discourse. And nowhere was this discourse more influential than in the Russian literary canon. So today, I'll propose that anti-Blackness, a set of philosophical propositions about subjectivity and humanity, occupies the center of the Russian literary canon, which in turn made and continues to make the idea of Russianness. The realist writer Ivan Turgenev is one such theorist of Russian racialization. I want to introduce his racial thinking with a scandal. So in 1860, 1 year before the abolition of serfdom, Turgenev became aware of an unbecoming rumor circulating in Heidelberg about himself. Apparently, he writes to Herzen, people there are saying that I'm forcibly keeping a serf mistress and that Madame Beecher Stowe publicly reproached me for this and that I railed at her. So the rumor hinges on the idea that the American abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe would find a natural object of critique in a Russian enserfer. Turgenev, who debuted in Russian letters with his anti-serfdom sketches of peasant life, had been generally well received by US abolitionists. Earlier that year, Charles Sumner cited his notes of a hunter in Congress, the Senator Charles Sumner. Yet Beecher Stowe's alleged complaint was not an objection to serfdom as such, but to its sexual violence against white women, or, as this was often termed in the period, white slavery. Reckoning on a contradiction of terms, the notion that white people, and particularly the protected category of white women, were not supposed to be enslaved, white slavery panic proliferated across media, from melodramatic tales of Russian peasant women imperiled by their enserfers' sexual advances, like this 1845 novel, The White Slave or the Russian Peasant. This was by this Belgian-British writer, C.F. Henningsen, who went on to be a Confederate general in the Civil War. I see this in the same discourse as paintings like Gérôme's famous Slave Market. Turgenev was actually acquainted with Gérôme. So these artifacts preferred the sexually available white woman, whether in a literary narrative or visually, and the moral sensation of pity and aroused abolitionism that all the while disavowed sexual violence against enslaved Black people and Indigenous people. So as Maria Tarutina and others have demonstrated, Russian artists participated in this discourse, so in paintings like this. But in this period, perhaps the most famous artifact of white slavery discourse was the Greek slave, Hiram Powers' white marble sculpture of a nude woman in chains. The Greek slave has become a favorite object of Black studies, and I want to suggest today that the sculpture and the racializing discourse that it represents also stands at the center of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian studies. The Greek slave, after all, was displayed right in front of the Russian section of the Great Exhibition in London's Crystal Palace in 1851, a key site in abolitionist history and in Russian literature. So essentially, I think I have a floor plan. I'll show you real quick. The Russian exhibition and the US exhibition were right next to each other, which I think leads to this interesting interpretive situation for the visitors at the time and for us today. If we look here, the Greek slave is centered kind of in the middle. Draped in red velvet, with the sign for the Russian section in the left background. In remarking on the decorative art, so you see in the background these kind of large vases, something like this, spectators would have turned around, perhaps surprised to see a shameful emblem of Russian society and its association with serfdom displayed even more prominently next to these feats of decorative art. So both in London and beyond, spectators associated this figure with Russian serfdom really directly. One viewer in St. Louis writes, "In Russia, how many of thy sisters are doomed to a life of slavery?" when he sees the sculpture. He ends his apostrophe with a call for, quote, "the complete emancipation of all the white people of the earth," unquote. Another copy of Powers' sculpture belonged to the Russian prince Anatoly Demidov, and this copy, which you see now, actually belongs to the Yale University Art Gallery. Interestingly, Turgenev very well may have seen this copy housed in Demidov's Florentine villa, which Turgenev may have visited when he toured Italy in 1858. I wonder if Turgenev did visit it. Did he connect the alarmist message of the sculpture, a message about bonded white women, to his own enserfer practice, and then later to the rumors about Stowe? This question is especially enticing because during this period of white slavery fervor, Turgenev was hard at work on a novel about the sexual relationship between a Russian nobleman and a peasant woman. First published in 1862, Fathers and Children depicts the conflicts between noblemen and their adult children in the Russian countryside of 1859, on the eve of the abolition of serfdom. Nikolai Kirsanov is anxiously reforming his estate, freeing enserfed peasants and ceding much of his land to them. His ultimate act of progressivism is, at the novel's end, his marriage to Fenechka, a peasant housekeeper with whom he had a child less than 1 year earlier. Fathers and Children is a canonical Russian novel, known mostly for the plot about Arkady Kirsanov and his friend Bazarov, who spars verbally and then physically with Arkady's conservative uncle, Pavel, and falls in love with the noblewoman Anna Odintsova. However, by reading this canonical work with the insights of Black feminist criticism, I present this cross-class marriage plot in Fathers and Children not as a pastoral love story, but as a Russian literary intervention in transnational debates on race, bonded labor, and sexual violence. I argue that by narrating Fenechka's departure from tropes of hypersexuality, animality, and opacity, and into white feminine humanity, Turgenev suggests, as if rebuffing the phantom Beecher Stowe, that the enlightened Russian nobleman can help his peasants transition into independence, and it follows into whiteness. Yet, in my close readings, I indicate how Turgenev tries and fails to whiten Fenechka definitively. By novel's end, one wonders whether Nikolai may be forcibly keeping a serf mistress. So recently, Aisha Khan has asked how scholars in our area field might identify race without pre-confirming it, might avoid superimposing a presentist or ethnocentric lens onto phenomena that require a more relativist or historicist approach. While attending to her call, I also insist that the history of slavery is not, as Paul Gilroy has put it, the special property of Black people, but rather a part of the ethical and intellectual heritage of the West as a whole, to which Russia emphatically belongs. I also want to bring in the film scholar Parisa Vaziri, who's writing about Indian Ocean studies, her field that she works on, and this field's reticence to consider anti-Blackness in its claims about bonded labor in that region. She writes, "The legacy of Indian Ocean world slavery is generally characterized as non-racial because it is opposed to a history of racial slavery against which its differences are easy to define. And yet, this very distinction between racial and non-racial slavery continues to be articulated through Blackness." I think the same can be said about the historical exploration of serfdom in our field through reference to chattel slavery. It's this comparative operation, the definition of Russianness through the vestibule of Blackness, that is at the heart of what I'm talking about today. In Saidiya Hartman's terms, it's the use of Blackness as an imaginative surface on which to form other ideas, in which racialized chattel slavery becomes the quintessential form of bonded labor and abjection, an index for these very phenomena transhistorically. What we need, I'm suggesting, is not more abstract comparisons of slavery and serfdom, but a history of the very comparison itself, a comparison that writers like Turgenev undertook in their fiction. Crucially, race is not historical content that comes to be represented in literature. Rather, literature racializes its characters, authors, readers, and even its constitutive forms. In modern European traditions, the marriage plot gives form to questions of freedom and bondage, as a character's journey to the altar enacts the formation of liberal subjecthood. Because the marriage plot is impossible for non-white women and white women in bondage, the novelistic aesthetic reckons on the whiteness of its heroine. So, for example, in her 1860 autobiographical novel, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Harriet Jacobs emphasizes how being Black precludes her from ending her literary narrative in the usual way, with marriage. Legally free white women characters also navigate the problem of freedom. Charlotte Bronte represents Jane Eyre's cross-class marriage in the 1847 novel of that name as a transformation from employee to wife. And Russian authors also probe this question. If a woman must be a liberal white subject, someone who can enter into a contract as an equal in order to be marriageable, then can one ever truly marry a peasant woman? A few years before he began Fathers and Children, Turgenev meditates on this problem as an enserfer reforming his own estate, and he meditates on it in the language of racial difference. He writes, "Although of the same blood, the master and the serf in their relations are men of two races, beings of two species. So how do we reconcile hostile interests, make peace, and sign a new pact?" While Turgenev remained pessimistic about this possibility, I argue that the cross-class marriage plot in Fathers and Children serves as metonymical pact with the peasantry. And just as the generic coherence of the marriage plot relies on the impossibility of Black women's marriage plots, Fenechka's symbolic toggling between white slave and emancipated white woman relies on the logic of anti-Blackness. In this period, Russian writers are making arguments about race not only in narratives with characters of color, but also in narratives with apparently homogeneous all-Russian casts. Such texts often feature what Shakespeare scholar David Sterling Brown calls an intra-racial color line, in which the language of anti-Blackness describes or affects social exclusion between white characters. By illustrating the intra-racial color line in this novel, I suggest that the question of Russian whiteness, often euphemized as Europeanness or Westernness, animates the Russian literary canon. And so by reading Russian literature with Black feminist theory, I'm not trying to impose Western thought on a separate region, but instead gesture toward the connected history of these two contexts. By dispensing with the comparative approach and studying the continuity, we can then ask, what if Blackness and Russianness were not created in the same way, with histories and legacies of bonded labor, or in different ways, but in some way created one another in this period? I propose that anti-Blackness, in some sense, made the Russian literary canon, which in turn made and continues to make ideas about race worldwide. One early critic of Fathers and Children said, "What can be emptier than Fenechka?" Yet this stupid Fenechka gains almost more admirers than the clever Odintsova. So if the critic deems Fenechka an unrealistic heroine for a marriage plot, then within the novel too, Pavel Kirsanov also deems her an inappropriate object of a nobleman's affection, in this case of his own affection. After his duel with Bazarov, he exclaims, "Ah, how I love this empty creature." So both diegetically and extra-diegetically, the novel asks, is it possible to love a being without subjectivity? In the decades leading up to Turgenev's novel, Russian literature itself developed in part as gentry writers answered this question. Serfdom, which denied the peasantry's basic material needs and access to education, and licensed enserfers' sexual violence against the enserfed, gave rise to literary discourse about peasant women's stupidity and hypersexuality. In fact, Turgenev has some juvenilia along these lines. I'll let you read. This is from a comic poem that he does. So along with these comic genres, we also have, starting from the late 18th century, genres of sentimentalism, which I see Fathers and Children as a descendant of, in which authors are elaborating counter-arguments about peasant women's humanity and virtue, their belonging to the racial category of whiteness and the gendered category of femininity. Arguments enacted through narratives about seduction and reciprocity beyond the landlord economy. So we can think about Karamzin's Poor Liza, or Grigorievich, the Village in 1846, or Pisimsky's A Bitter Fate in 1859. Yet these liberal works about enserfed women were written against the stereotype of the inhuman, hypersexual peasant woman, and thus inevitably remain within that discourse. So for example, the playwright Pisimsky ventriloquizes this foundational perspective by including a nobleman character in his play who objects to his friend's relationship with an enserfed woman. This character says, "Our fathers used to squander their money on gypsies, but at least those women were passionate. But our peasant woman is an unhewn block of wood. Is it possible to fall in love with such a half animal?" So in this passage, if the Roma lover is hyper-expressive, then the Russian peasant woman is by contrast unfeeling, even inanimate. The stupid, animal, unimpressible peasant woman, what Pavel called an empty creature, is a problematic character for the ruling class and its writers. Unlike a sex worker, she exists beyond contract, and unlike a noblewoman, she's outside the discourse of love and consent. How then to represent the perspective of an unimpressible being, seemingly unmoved by desires? Turgenev's character note for Fenechka reveals this paradoxical writerly task. He describes her as a good-looking, pretty brunette, voluptueuse in the Russian manner, white and soft. Her disposition was very quiet and reasonable, even cold, like my daughter's. She was rather intelligent, neat, quite perceptive. She almost never left her annex, like the gypsy that S. Tolstoy lives with. She didn't love anyone with her heart. Bazarov stirred her, but she would hardly have given herself to him. Describe well their intercourse and that kiss. In this passage, Turgenev emphasizes Fenechka's whiteness somatically and by highlighting her intelligence and rationality. Yet, by comparing her to his peasant daughter, he suggests that Fenechka's coldness is an attribute of her class, something like unimpressibility. Calling her voluptuous in the Russian manner, he suggests that there's a default voluptuousness that Fenechka inhabits in an ethnically specific way, before going on to compare her with a Romany woman. He further distances Fenechka from whiteness by terming Bazadov's kiss snashenia, the scientific term for the mating of animals. In this passage, Fenechka appears white upon first glance, and there's also an interesting section of this character sketch where he talks about her quickness to blush, which is definitely a racializing trope for white women. But he also does these direct racial comparisons that complicate her categorization. I want to take a moment to stop and talk about sex work as an important site of racial coding in this period. In the Russian Empire, Romany women were associated with both rural and urban sex work, a kind of counterpart to rural Russian peasant sex workers or sexually violable enserfed women. Sander Gilman, writing of Western Europe, has indicated how in the 19th century, white sex workers were often conflated with Black women in popular culture. And scholars in critical Romani studies have indicated the historical connection between Blackness and Romaniness in European discourses. So I think this relationship bears exploration in the Russian context as well. Turgenev, for one, describes the Romani woman Masha in his Notes of a Hunter, also living with an enserfer and having sex with him, as, quote, all Black as if carved from ebony, unquote. So somewhere in this nexus of Blackness and Romaniness and whiteness, Turgenev is identifying or placing the Russian peasant woman. And his ambivalent description of Fenechka gets at an important theme in Russian literature of this period, which is that Blackness as a Western concept becomes a tool to characterize people of different ethnicities in the Russian Empire. Now, most readers of Fathers and Children will remember Fenechka as a minor character, at best, but she haunts the novel's very opening with Arkady's bleak homecoming. The university graduate, returning home to his father's estate, sees signs of peasant poverty everywhere in the carriage ride home, as his father tells him stutteringly that he's taken up with Fenechka and moved her into the main house. The chapter ends that night in Fenechka's dark quarters with the revelation that she has a baby. The novel's opening has a Gothic quality, suggesting that for the Kirsanovs' attempts at reform, they're still haunted by the violence of serfdom. Pavel, in particular, resents Fenechka's presence in the manor house. The next morning, after Arkady and Bazadov's arrival, he enters her room unannounced. "I see you've made changes in here," he says, "those curtains." Fenechka insists that her presence is licensed by her connection to Nikolai, but Pavel continues to suggest that she doesn't know her place. Finally, he asks to see his nephew, and Fenechka goes to get the baby dressed. Alone, surveying Fenechka's belongings, Pavel sees that she has some rather poor photographs of Nikolai Petrovich in various poses taken by an itinerant artist. The photograph of Fenechka that hangs on the wall, however, is a complete failure. Some sort of eyeless face gave out a forced smile in a dark frame. Nothing else could be made out. Fenechka lacks the animacy attributed to Nikolai in his many portraits in various poses. Crucially, her portrait is ruined because it's too dark and fails to represent her face, the physical site denoting humanity and psychological interiority. The dark portrait suggests its sitter's incompatibility with whiteness, both chromatically and symbolically. According to art historian Cecile Bishop, the discursive conflation of enslaved bodies with the chromatic qualities of the color Black, and particularly its opacity, was used in portraiture to exclude slaves from the codes of subjective legibility. As various scholars, including Maria Terutina, have demonstrated, this problem of Black subjectivity has figured into Russian visual artistic production as well. So in this scene, Fenechka's forced smile metonymizes her relationship with Nikolai. Given the sexual violence of serfdom, this association may be as forced as her smile, and Fenechka may be captured in life as in the frame. This reading is reinforced by the following passage, in which the narrator tells the story of Nikolai's relationship with Fenechka. Though he's not her enserfer, Fenechka is the daughter of the manners-free housekeeper who dies before the novel's opening. Nikolai performs the cliched role of the nobleman pursuing a woman he enserfs. So the narrator writes, "At first, she shied away from him, and once, toward evening, meeting him on a narrow footpath through a field, she turned off into the tall, thick rye, overgrown with wormwood and cornflowers, so as not to be seen by him. He spotted her little head through the golden network of rye, from which she peered out like a little animal, and called out to her affectionately, 'Hello, Fenechka, I don't bite.' 'Hello, sir,' she whispered, without leaving her hiding place." Contrasting the human hunter, Nikolai, and the animal prey, Fenechka, Turgenev emphasizes her captivity and her exclusion from humanity. But Turgenev does not sustain this violent image. Interestingly, the narrator abruptly abandons this intricately detailed scene and describes the start of their sexual relationship in the vaguest of terms. Gradually, she grew used to him, but was still timid in his presence, when suddenly her mother, Arina, died from cholera. Where was Fenechka to go? She had inherited her mother's love of order, common sense, and propriety, but she was so young and alone. Nikolai Petrovich was such a kind, modest man. There is no need to tell the rest. In his lectures on Russian literature, Vladimir Nabokov skewers Turgenev for, quote, prudently and prudishly, unquote, foregoing narrating the sexual relationship. A little rich coming from Nabokov, but he's noticed something essential. Nikolai's scene with Fenechka is not a narratable encounter, both because it's taboo, but also because it doesn't provoke any suspense. Given what we know of serfdom's sexual economy, we can guess what happened. And so the realist author demurs, for the moment, from finishing the telling, dosказывать. At this point in the novel, Fenechka's relationship with Nikolai leaves her in unnarratable territory. Her encounter with Bazarov, however, launches her into the efficient hydraulics of the marriage plot. After Bazarov leaves Odintsova, he returns to the Kirsanov estate and spends more time with Fenechka. One morning, in the Kirsanov garden, they strike up a conversation which ends with Bazarov kissing her and Pavel seeing them. In this scene, Turgenev overwrites the unnarratable seduction by Nikolai in the rye field with a narratable seduction by Bazarov. Because Bazarov is of mixed class background, associated with the peasantry in many moments, and himself figured as animal and outside liberal subjecthood in the novel, and definitely by critics who really hated him, Fenechka emerges from this encounter, by contrast, less the peasant. While their interaction at first suggests a threatening class solidarity, the kiss scene results in her invitation into the rubric of white ruling class femininity, in turn enabling her marriage to Nikolai. So during Bazarov's second stay, Fenechka begins displaying the attributes of subjecthood around him. Turgenev writes, not only did she trust him and have no fear of him, but she was actually freer, volnее, and more forward, развязнее, with him than with Nikolai. Fenechka's intimacy with Bazarov can be interpreted either as the undiscerning hypersexuality of the peasant or the desiring subjectivity of a subject. One morning, as Fenechka gathers roses in the garden, the latter seems more likely. Dressed in a light white dress, she herself seemed whiter and lighter. A tan didn't stick to her, and the heat, which she couldn't protect herself from, gave a slight blush to her cheeks and ears, and pouring a quiet laziness into her whole body was reflected in the drowsy languor in her pretty little eyes. She could hardly work. Her hands kept falling into her lap. She could barely walk and groaned and complained with an amusing impotence. In this passage, the heat seems to have made Fenechka whiter, both with her blushing skin and her aristocratic sense of languor. Read as the prelude to the kiss scene, the passage likens the sun to Bazarov, two seducers that may blacken Fenechka, one somatically, the other symbolically. In the ensuing scene, to turn from non-white peasant into white noblewoman, Fenechka must prove impressible and willful, human enough to desire Bazarov's advances and also principled enough, according to the rubric of white feminine honor, to deny them. Seeing him in the garden, Fenechka, quote, raises the edge of her kerchief a little so she could look at him, unquote. Then she asks about a book he's carrying, and their flirtation gathers around her illiteracy. She even confesses her preference for Bazarov over Pavel. Quote, I don't even know what your quarrels were about, but I saw how you twisted him around your little finger, unquote. The positive exchange continues until Bazarov suggests that she owes him for his medical services to her baby. At that point, Fenechka raised her eyes to look at Bazarov, eyes that seemed even darker from the whitish reflection on the upper part of her face. She turns white with dark eyes as she realizes she's caught in a seduction attempt, some repetition of her first encounter with Nikolai. This moment, I think, is also an inversion of her photographic state. She's petrified, but now chromatically white. After Bazarov walks back, Fenechka, quote, started laughing and even clapped her hands. So amusing did Bazarov's request seem to her, unquote. In this scene, she toggles between active, desired engagement with Bazarov and petrification, between a deviant peasant sexuality and a virtuous noble one. However, when Bazarov suddenly kisses her, Fenechka shuddered, pushed him away with both her hands against his chest, but she pushed weakly, and he was able to renew and prolong his kiss. Grammatically and physically, Fenechka experiences a crisis of agency. She receives a kiss, doesn't kiss Bazarov, that she recoups by pushing, though her push is not powerful enough to stop the kiss. Yet, after Pavel interrupts them, Fenechka immediately moved to the other end of the bench. Did Bazarov suddenly allow her release? Did she actually attempt to stop the kiss earlier? This is something that the narrator displays a lot of anxiety about, because all we know at the end of the day is that Fenechka whispers shame on you to Bazarov in a tone of sincere reproach at the end of the encounter. In this moment, by specifying Fenechka's sincerity, Turgenev's narrator suggests that this scene is less about the transgression of the kiss than about the impossibility of knowing Fenechka's desire, and thus of categorizing her as either active, interiorized, white, free, a subject, or as passive, empty, opaque, unfree, a non-subject. Always a matter of interpretation, then, Fenechka's identity is determined at the end of the novel by Pavel, who ultimately entreats Nikolai to marry her. It's kind of a homosocial proposal scene. Pavel says, no, dear brother, we've spent enough time putting on airs and worrying about what other people think. Let's do our duty just as you say and see if we can achieve happiness in the bargain. What are castes in the 19th century? So this marriage represents the family's political rebranding, an attempt to unite the groups that Turgenev earlier described as two races, two species in his journalism. Pavel asks Nikolai whether he should tell Fenechka about his plans to marry her, but Nikolai replies, what's the rush? This won't run away from us. At nas не уйдет. The novel's final scene reinforces marriage as captivity. Fenechka, now married and using the honorific Fedosya Nikolaevna, sits at the family table, respectfully still, respectful to herself, to everything that surrounded her, and smiled as if she wanted to say, forgive me, I'm not to blame. Encircled by employers turned kin, Fenechka gives a forced smile, much like the one in her dark portrait. In this final scene of a novel whose plot has supposedly confirmed her marriageability and whiteness, Fenechka remains associated with serfdom, a living ghost of this institution and its racializing meanings. She's given a seat at the table, that quintessential liberal gesture of inclusion, but still trapped, and her husband, in turn, vulnerable to foreign critics of white slavery. So rather than romanticizing Turgenev's fiction of cross-class intimacy because his characters are commonsensically white, and I think they are white, but the point is, the author is thematizing their whiteness, drawing on anti-Black tropes to redefine the peasantry in this era of emancipation. Fathers and Children is one example of how Russian writers' racial imagination shaped the aesthetic possibilities of literary production. Russia is both one field in the global continuum of anti-Blackness and a key site in the global imagination of whiteness in the 19th century and today. After all, if the Russian canon is enlisted to work for white supremacy, I'm thinking of reading suggestions by Jordan Peterson or the ethno-nationalist promotion of Dostoevsky in Russia today, then perhaps it's partly because these works propose Russia as a context beyond race, giving their readers the language to claim, to paraphrase Pavel, what is race in the 21st century? So like Powers, the Greek slave, Turgenev's novel is an artifact of 19th century racial thinking. And in its ongoing translation and dissemination as a Russian classic, it is, in fact, far more enduring in our collective imagination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. Thanks for a fascinating presentation. So we'll now have comments from Maria. So
thank you. So I'd like to just begin by thanking the organizers of 19V for inviting me to serve as a discussant today for this really rich and suggestive paper, which I think offers a compelling new model for rethinking canonical 19th century literary texts by centering questions of race and racialization, even and especially in novels with quote unquote all Russian casts. And I mean, there's so much to unpack and respond to in this really provocative presentation, but I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to limit myself to just a few comments and questions. And you'll have to forgive me, but as an art historian, my first question is sort of necessarily about the Crystal Palace exhibition. And one of the first images that you showed us, Fiona, and that's the Powers of the Greek slave, in this really interesting kind of position between the Russian and United States pavilions. And I'm just sort of wondering, given the immediate associations that period viewers made between the sculpture and Russian serfdom, how was this display not flagged as problematic by the Russian organizers of the Russian section, right? I just find that completely sort of mind-boggling and fascinating that it was just left there, right? And I'm just wondering what this suggests about Russian sensibilities and sort of racial discourse in this moment, that this was, sort of went off, was allowed to be shown in this way. I'm also really struck by your very incisive reading of Fenechka's failed photograph and the way it suggests the sitter's incompatibility with whiteness, both grammatically and symbolically, the terms you used. And of course, as you, I think, absolutely correctly point out, this was an established 19th century discourse about the difficulties of picturing dark skin, whether in paintings or photographs. And so, I find your reading really persuasive. But at the same time, I was sort of thinking that in this exact moment in the 1850s and 1860s, there is a rise in Black photography as a means of reclaiming Black dignity and empowering Black subjecthood in order to counteract racist caricatures, right, that distorted Black facial features. So the very idea of being pictured on one's own terms, right, as a kind of mode of empowerment. And so, for example, I mean, this is from an earlier moment, but I was thinking about Ivan Turgenev's portrait of Anushka, and that the very act of being pictured was meant to confer sort of social status and dignity to the sitter, but on the landowner's terms. So sort of thinking along those lines, I was wondering if there's potentially another way to read Fenechka's failed photograph as an act of resistance on her part, right? Her refusal to be pictured for Nikolai's visual delectation on his terms. Or is that perhaps attributing too much agency to her? But I was just wondering what you would say about that. The sort of final comment or question that I have is, as you persuasively demonstrated in your presentation, in Turgenev's Fathers and Children, racialization is deeply imbricated with notions of class and gender, in a way that is perhaps somewhat distinctive from the Euro-American context, Or would you argue that they're actually ultimately more on a continuum, which leads me to the perennial question of Russian exceptionalism? And at the time that Turgenev was writing Fathers and Children, there was this persistent refrain coming from certain Russian intellectual circles that unlike the racist, oppressive structures of Western Europe, Russia did not take part in anti-Black violence either directly or indirectly. So, for example, when referring to Alexander Pushkin's Blackness, Alexei Khomyakov claimed that Russians, quote, esteemed the poet the descendant of an Ethiopian with pride and joy, whereas he would have been denied citizenship in the United States and would not have had the right to marry the daughter of a washerwoman in Germany or a butcher in England, right? End of quotation. So sort of in light of these kinds of assertions, I'm just wondering if you could briefly, address how your reading of Turgenev's racialization of Fenechka through tropes of Blackness fits with these 19th century assertions of Russian exceptionalism and sort of purported anti-racism. And how you see those two being in dialogue. So I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to stop here so that there's plenty of time for FAQ. But thank you again for such a really, I think, provocative and rich paper.
Great. Thank you so much, Maria. You've raised some great questions. Fiona, you're welcome to respond. And meanwhile, if any of our participants has a question or comment, you're welcome to put it in the chat or else raise your hand. We will ask you to unmute yourselves. You can't unmute yourself on your own, but then we'll ask you when we see your hand or your comment, we'll ask you to unmute.
Thank you. Maria, thank you so much. These are all just the big questions. Yeah, so about the Crystal Palace, I haven't done much research into the Russian organizers of it, so that's kind of a direction for me to look into as I develop this. I think what's really interesting about it is that it's situated between pavilions, so I guess I won't share my screen again, but so the pavilions have like borders demarcating what it means to go into them. And then there's the central space that's the main thoroughfare that people will walk down. I think it's really important that the Greek slave is positioned in that thoroughfare. So there is an ambiguity for the spectator which pavilion this actually belongs to. And I think that potentially that's part of the power of it. Like it was an intentional choice to put it between the two nations that were famous for still having systems of bonded labor, kind of like doubling its valences of meaning. Yeah, I guess my guess in terms of liberal ruling class Russian sentiment, people like Turgenev, people like Herzen, many of whom were abroad or spent a lot of time abroad, formed their identity as Westernizers or just as like enlightened Russian ruling class members through the tension between their participation in serfdom and their moral upset about it. And I think Turgenev is just an excellent example of this in terms of documenting how he was really troubled by this tension throughout his life. So yeah, I think that's what I want to say about that. Yeah, in terms of portraiture and picturing dark skin, I think what's important about the Fenechka plot is that, like I said near the end of my talk, we really don't get many opportunities, and I think this is what Turgenev is anxious about, to see her pleasure, to like see her subjective enjoyment of much of anything, including the portrait. So in the passage, all we know is that Pavel is looking around her room and all he sees are her objects. So he and we can guess what Fenechka's relationships to the objects are, but also because she just was installed in this room, we don't know to what extent she's decorated, to what extent these objects have already been there. There's a really interesting detail that there's a portrait hanging on the wall along with the portraits of Nikolai and of herself. There's a portrait of General Yermolov, who was in the Caucasus. So, did she put that up? I don't know. Turgenev also notes that there's a book that she has in her room. So whose objects are these? I think that's what makes the scene really interesting for Pavel as well. Like, who is this peasant woman? Can she read? Like, what objects give her pleasure? And I think the photograph is kind of the climax of that problem of Fenechka's subjectivity. Does she take pleasure in her own portrait? Is it like a subjectivating artifact? Like, does she become more human in being photographed? My sense is that this is the very question, and we're not meant to have a clear answer on it. I also, didn't mention this, but in the 1850s, like, this was the period of more ethnographic portraiture. So people traveling around the Russian Empire and taking images, like very dorky, of artisan, workers with their tools of the trade. So we can also think about the class aspect of Nikolai maybe like engaging the services of a traveling photographer. It does make him kind of silly and kind of poshly in a certain way. And I think that's how we're meant to read the fact that he has all these different portraits in different positions, whereas she just has this really eerie one. I think it is it's Turgenev's criticism towards oblivious noblemen like Nikolai. And then I think the last and biggest question just about Russian exceptionalism in discourses about historical racism. I guess the first way that I've been thinking about this is there's a certain, like what you're describing with Khamyakov, I think is more of a Slavophile orientation towards articulating Russianness as the most multicultural and Russianness is this container that has the capacity to fold everything else into it. It's incredibly arms wide open. This is a very imperial gesture, obviously. But I think that's how we can understand the claims about Pushkin as being welcomed and able to thrive in Russia as a mixed race person. And so this is kind of like how we see Dostoevsky near the end of the century thinking about Russianness and ideas of racial difference. But I think it's important, and I think actually it's very instructive if we're going to talk about the literary canon and ideas of race, to think about Turgenev and Dostoevsky as opposites or at ends of the spectrum of thinking, because Turgenev, to my mind, like in being interested in aligning himself with Western thought, is actually doing so by taking up Western abolitionist discourse and Western racial logics of Blackness being equated with slaveness. So I think Turgenev, we can read him as more of a European writer of race to some extent. I'll end there, but thank you and excited to talk more.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from Joan Newberger, and anyone else, please don't hesitate to raise your hand or put something in the chat. I see. Great, thank you, Joan. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Fiona, for this really, really interesting talk, and incredibly subtle, close readings, and you've really answered a lot of questions that I've had in working on Turgenev and his gendering of nature, which is one of the things I'm interested in right now. But I want to, like, what you've done is give us a way in which some of the more common themes in Turgenev's gender treatment of women, and you've shown how this is also a discourse of race. So that's like incredibly useful. But I want to flip it back, if you don't mind, and ask what this racialized discourse has to say about gender and about predatory male, the predatory male gaze in Turgenev, but also then, but I want to put it in so I'm a historian and I want to put it in this is probably an unfair historian's question, but by the time Turgenev wrote that quote about being two different races that can never, have anything to do with each other, basically. He already had at least one daughter, if not more, by a serf girl. And also the quote that really leaped out at me was from the beginning when he was appalled that someone might think he was keeping a serf mistress, when in fact he had no qualms about using his mother's serfs, female serfs, for sex. And so much of the discourse, the gender discourse in Notes of a Hunter, and in Fathers and Sons, Fathers and Children, is this sort of male predatory gaze. So I'm just wondering if you have any insight into the ways in which his own personal experience shaped his anxieties about the treatment of women, of serf women. It just seems very, it seems to me, first of all, that he's projecting these on his ideas about nature. But so I'm just curious about how he's projecting these onto his ideas about race. And again, thank you for a fantastic talk.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, I guess just to start with nature, something that I've noticed as a trope in some of the writings that I discussed as like the genealogy that leads us to Fathers and Children in this cross-class plot. A big trope is that, so where do sexual encounters happen between the enserfed and enserfers? It's outside. So it's on the lands that the enserfer owns, and typically it will be the enserfed person at work. So like the interruption of work in fields, or like often in the forest. And we see this even at the end of the century already, when Tolstoy is retrospectively like turning this into this grotesque pastiche, I guess, something like the devil. The encounter quintessentially happens outside. So I think it's important when we think about nature and Turgenev and space and land ownership and the kind of labor that happens, I guess take seriously the fact that this was sex work. So to call it that doesn't mean that it was consensual, but that there's some exchange. Sex is happening in these economic conditions in the rural landlord economy. I think that's really exciting territory for 19th centuryists, because of course, sex work is associated with like urban spheres and modernity, but it happens throughout the 19th century in these rural landscapes. So how do we make sense of this, and how did writers write about this or represent this? And I keep returning to the idea of anxiety, not to psychoanalyze Turgenev or any of these writers, but just because I think what I'm realizing is that what we might call hypocrisy, so like you said, the fact that Turgenev did have these relationships and he had children from these relationships, and was really open about that, like the idea that he's actually working through this perceived hypocrisy in his own life through fiction and particularly realist novels provide an occasion to think about these problems, and particularly if the realist novel calls for a cast of characters who have varying levels of subjectivity. It's like, okay, what if the novel is an experiment for the enserfer rapist to imagine the subjectivity of this category of people who he has violated? I think that was really important to these writers. And I guess I'll just end by saying that maybe another way we can reckon with the naughtiness of this, or like the hypocrisy, is by thinking about genre. So I shared that poem that Turgenev wrote when he was really young, because I think it shows how certain comedic or short genres allow the expression of taboo behaviors or ideas in ways that like the novel in 1862 doesn't. But even at the end of his life, Turgenev writes letters that kind of are pretty joking about his sexual relationships with enserfed women. Edmond Goncourt publishes one of these. So I think if we just read beyond the famous and then canonized novels into the writer's other production, we see the diversity of like tactics or aesthetics that they use to talk about the same issue.
Great, thanks. So I wanted to give Allison Smith an opportunity. If you wanted to comment on, Allison put a link in the chat about with illustrations from Hudожественный листок about things that Russia sent to the exhibition in London. There was no art section in that exhibition, but they did send objects that would be considered, what would you call it? Art industry. So Allison, did you want to comment on that, or you can unmute yourself, I think. No, you can't. Okay.
Oh, I am now. I just wanted to say, like, I literally happened to be looking, and when you mentioned that, I wasn't even looking for that. It came up. I just put it in the chat in case it's of interest, but it wasn't really there. I will note, some of those things came up. I wrote a piece in Joan's book, Picturing Russian Empire, about that picture of Anushka by Argunov. And all of those issues really came up as I tried to work on that, because there's some evidence that she was the mother of some of Sheremetyev's acknowledged children born out of wedlock, but how to think about that and the ways that that played into their relationship, and the ways that, in particular, she ends up with a portrait that allows us to see her, is one of these other sort of like really challenging questions that come up. And one of the things that I really had to face was thinking about how sort of the idea again of how our contemporary tendency to place racial categories on people in the past would have been understood in not necessarily racial terms, but in ways that are in other ways sort of speaking to physical othering or social othering or other sorts of things and all this. So it's a whole bunch of really challenging things. But anyway, the link just might be of interest if you happen to take a look at it.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we also have, let's see, in this order, we have Ksenia Un, and then I think Kirill Zubkov, and then Olga Mayorova. So Ksenia, when you're able to unmute yourself.
Hi, Fiona. Thank you very much for your talk. I enjoyed it. I love the especially kind of quotes from earlier Turgenev writing that really brought the text you're reading to light. About Fenechka's photograph, I think the fact that there's a smile there really separates it from the ethnographic genre and kind of illuminates the potential for this expression of agency in a really powerful way. At first, I was wondering whether she was moving, but no, the text distinctly says it's darkness that's the issue, not movement or a lack of resolution. But my question today is about the visibility of this kind of racialization and the differences we can tease out between the American system of bonded labor and the Russian one. So I'm wondering if, since you engage with Black feminist discourse, you've thought about kind of the visibility of the sexual violence in terms of the children that resulted from it. So in the American context, I think there's a different set of anxieties in terms of miscegenation, whereas in the kind of Russian context, there's less visibility because of this, the lack of Blackness of the children and the lack of a kind of a system like you have in the US in terms of determining the level of racial other that can be ascribed to these children. So especially in terms of like Black feminist reappraisals of like mama's baby, papa's maybe, how can you kind of go further into this visibility and racialization between these two very connected discourses, which I think your talk shows so well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is an element that is really important, the reproduction and then kinship networks that are allowed to happen under serfdom, and then I guess how they're represented in narrative. Something I've thought a lot about is kind of what you're gesturing towards is the plot of the mixed class background child. And you're right that because the racial markers don't necessarily have the final word on the fate of, let's say, Nikolai and Fenechka's child, who will kind of grow up and come of age in the 1880s. But nevertheless, there still is a lot of literature that's narrativizing this problem. And I think in part, narrativizing it because, or thanks to Russian consumption of melodramas from the West. So like the tragic mulatta genre in US literature makes its way to the Russian Empire. There's a really fascinating novel co-authored by Nekrasov and Panayeva called Dead Lake from the early 1850s that talks about a mixed race or, like child of a Romani woman and Russian noble man, and like what happens to her and who is she able to marry when she comes of age. So I think the importation of Western genres that themselves grow out of the context of chattel slavery and race, like come to Russia. But sometimes authors come up with weird ways to apply that literary aesthetic to the case of serfdom. I guess the only other thing I would say is I think another important work in Turgenev's oeuvre, I always try to avoid saying that word, but is Asya, which he wrote before Fathers and Children, but the heroine is the daughter of a peasant woman and a nobleman. And it's really interesting. Pisaryev, or no, yeah, I think Pisaryev has this crazy article about it where he talks about how Asya is kind of like biologically more hypersexual than ruling class young ladies, and compares her to a Native American in her kind of like hypersexuality and life force. So there's definitely this sense that people from mixed class backgrounds can be understood almost as like the products of as like mixed race. But thank you.
Great. Okay. Kirill, you have a couple of comments, small comments you say in the chat. Did you want to unmute and verbalize, or do you want to, perhaps Fiona wants to just respond, or should I read them? We'll unmute you and see if you want to speak. Can you unmute yourself? Not yet. Could we have Kirill Zubkov unmuted, please? There we go.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Fiona. This is, I think this is a very important issue that you are bringing up, and I think this, yeah, and of course, this is, I mean, historically very relevant because, of course, the Russian literary critics and Russian authors were in 1860s were thinking, writing, publishing a lot of texts about the racial issues. So yeah, so thank you for bringing this up. So yeah, I just have two small comments. So first, Bazarov is of course a nobleman, and this is a very important issue for the novel, as far as I understand it. I mean, his father, Bazarov's father, owns an estate. So, as far as I understand it, Bazarov legally had no other choice but to be a nobleman. And yeah, and second, about being sometimes, yeah, I think that you offer a very original and interesting interpretation of this, but it is also important that being sentence means being like exposed to the elements. Means working in the open and things like this. So, and Bazarov has red hands. This is also an important fact that also reveals that he is also somewhat exposed to the elements. So I think this, so, and those two comments, they are again small and might seem not important, but I think that they reveal an important problem of like correlation between racial and class distinctions in Turgenev's imagination. And of course, I mean, you have discussed this in your talk, but I would like to pay attention to this constant like blurring of those borders between class, race, and other issues in the social imagination of Russian authors of mid-19th century. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think Bazarov is probably the most visibly or like explicitly, he's the character who most explicitly traverses that intra-racial color line that I talked about. And exactly what you're talking about, kind of, he is a nobleman, but somehow through his radical politics and through his practice as a doctor and through the way he places himself in social proximity to peasants in ways that I think we're meant to laugh at, like, okay, this is a nobleman who's like trying to buddy, in ways that many peasant characters don't appreciate. So he's attempting these class affiliations, and I think in the eyes particularly of Pavel, but I think readers of the day, this association with the peasantry also does have these racial associations. So thank you for the noticing the detail about the gloves, which I hadn't noticed, but I do think it's important that Bazarov like intentionally treats his hands in a way that recalibrates his class, which then has racial meanings as well. So I think we're in agreement.
Yeah, I mean, just meant that the Bazarov just actually breaks like the normal rules in the sense that no person is supposed to wear gloves. Bazarov doesn't.
Great, fascinating, wonderful. So Olga, go ahead.
Thank you very much for this event, and thank you, Fiona, for extremely interesting talk. I have one brief question about Fenechka's social background. It's kind of, I don't think it's absolutely clear in the novel, but at this point, I don't have the quotes or the specific moments in the novel to point to refer to point out to, or to refer to. But there is a kind of, there are words about Fenechka belonging to mещанство and belonging to peasantry. So it's the tricky thing, and I think the word mещанство is mentioned in the novel, but this needs to be double checked. So definitely she is not a serf. She is not enserfed, as you clearly indicated. She belongs to peasantry, but is it still peasantry? Is her social status is still peasantry or mещанство? This remains unclear to me, and maybe you can clarify this, but definitely I think Kirill's question and my question are suggesting the same, that Russian society at that time is extremely heterogeneous, and it's not like two classes, the nobility and the peasantry, that we tend to think about. It's more nuances, more differences, more categories. So I definitely think that Fenechka is somehow associated with mещанство, but this needs to be double checked. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think you're totally right. And I think Turgenev makes a lot out of the ambiguity. So I think it's really important that he didn't choose to make this cross-class marriage plot between someone who is actually enserfed. I think in just like political discourse and then the conventions of realism, that just like wouldn't have made sense. So the particulars of her is that after Nikolai starts freeing his enserfed people, as he starts undertaking reforms kind of before it's legally made mandatory, he travels and he stays in an inn in this neighboring provincial town. I think this is really important because it indicates, okay, this is not a peasant who lives on his land, which is really important to kind of like get out under the trope of, you know, a nobleman starting a relationship with a peasant on his land. So second of all, he stays at this inn. The innkeeper is really great. He thinks also that she's German, maybe, because she's so tidy and good at running the inn. And so then he invites her to come and live on his estate and be his new housekeeper for pay. So I see the introduction of that character. And so Fenechka is her daughter. The introduction of that character needs to be read as part of a characterization attempt of Nikolai. So like this is a good liberal nobleman who's trying really hard to transform the running of his estate before legal emancipation into full, just like salaried workers. So Fenechka is her daughter. And I think it's important that after, like in the passage that I read about the start of the sexual relationship, it's actually not describing the start of the sexual relationship. It's describing the moment when Fenechka takes on the role of main housekeeper after her mother has died. So what he narrates is like her ascension into like a new employee status. But yeah, I think that innkeeper, at least in my understanding, is less peasant associated and more mieszanstwo. So thank you.
And this makes a huge difference because mieszanstwo is perceived as a social group with more individual agency. And since you talked about a sense of agency with regard to Fenechka, I think it would enrich your paper if you discuss this, if you discuss the mieszanstwo background. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yes, good. Okay, good. Any other questions, comments? You're welcome to raise your virtual or physical hand or put something in the chat. So if we have our questions settled, then maybe we'll just wrap up. But this has just been a really interesting discussion, a wonderful paper. You've given us lots to think about, and it's just been really fascinating. So thank you so much to Fiona. Thank you to Maria for your comments and your thoughts, and thanks to everyone who's been here today. We will resume in the new year. So best wishes for the holidays, the New Year's celebration, and we will see you on January 22nd for our beginning of our 2025 season. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.